دومدي تاك دومدي تاك اسألينا أجوبتنا على المحك يا ليه دومدي تاك سايرة فينا السفينة بس ما ياكلنا السمك دومدي تاك اسألينا أجوبتنا على المحك يا ليه دومدي تاك سايرة فينا السفينة بس ما ياكلنا السمك
حياة كئيبة ما بتعطي شمل لحد واللي كان عنده أمل صفطوا الدنيا على المحك في ناس في الغربة هتشوفك ابن بلد ويسألوك هل جاي سياحة ولا الوضع ألهبك أوقاتنا صعبة والرحلة طريقها مد حاولت إني أفكر فيها من التفكير عقل ارتبك والساعة واقفة ما بتمشيش زمنتك بس بالمواقف الحلوة بتلف زي المفك
دومدي تاك اسألينا أجوبتنا على المحك يا ليه دومدي تاك سايرة فينا هالسفينة بس ما ياكلنا السمك دومدي تاك اسألينا أجوبتنا على المحك يا ليه دومدي تاك سايرة فينا هالسفينة بس ما ياكلنا السمك
دومدي تاك مجنون بنظرتي للدنيا بستناها تمشي مع اني عارف انه الدنيا الدولار بس فيها بمشي رفعنا ايدنا بس للي خلقنا ما مدينا ايدنا لي بشرت اكتب كتير صرت اغني سؤال مر علينا ليه حياتنا كلها هيك فيش سكينة لا في راحة لو ضحكنا بضحكة فيك قالوا اضحك للدنيا تضحك لك من ضحكي مليت حتى حظي شارد بجيتار وانا لحكو بسكاليت
دومدي تاك اسألينا أجوبتنا على المحك يا ليه دومدي تاك سايرة فينا هالسفينة بس ما ياكلنا السمك
دومدي تاك اسألينا أجوبتنا على المحك دومدي تاك سايرة فينا هالسفينة بس ما ياكلنا السمك سلامي للي عاشوا كافح ما بيحكي يا ريت بيسعى رغم اللي بيصير ليسوي نفسه من هالجيت مصيرها تزبط وتكون عاليائس جواتنا هيت فحاول اوعك تحكي حظي معطر وانا في ابتليت ظلمنا حالنا وهملناها روحنا هيك كتير حتى عقلك وتفكيرك محتاجينه للتقدير فانسك من الكآبة ركز هسه باللي بصير خلي روحك حلوة لانه لازمها تغيير
دومدي تاك اسألينا أجوبتنا على المحك يا ليه دومدي تاك سايرة فينا هالسفينة بس ما ياكلنا السمك دومدي تاك اسألينا أجوبتنا على المحك يا ليه دومدي تاك سايرة فينا هالسفينة بس ما ياكلنا السمك دومدي تاك اسألينا أجوبتنا على المحك يا ليه دومدي تاك سايرة فينا هالسفينة بس ما ياكلنا السمك.
Good evening. My name is Cindy Corrie. On behalf of the Rachel Corrie Foundation for Peace and Justice and the Madison Rafa Sister City Project, welcome to our webinar, Holding Israel Accountable, Remembering Rachel Corrie. 19 years ago today, on March 16th, 2003, word came to my family via CNN that an Olympia woman had been killed by the Israeli military in the Gaza Strip. Minutes later, the message scrolling across the bottom of the TV screen was updated to Rachel Corrie of Olympia, Washington, killed in the Gaza Strip. In the midst of my family's grief came the nearly immediate realization that we also had to act. Every year since, with the support of our Olympia community and friends across the US and world, we've stopped on this date to remember by learning, by taking action, and by strengthening our connections to each other, locally and beyond, with those who care about Palestinian rights and peace with justice. We will do so this evening as well. Scrolling through the list of registrants for today's webinar is a journey through my 19-year history with the issue of Palestine. Thank you to each of you for joining us, our old friends and new. Thank you to our volunteers from Olympia, Madison, and beyond who've stepped up and worked diligently these past weeks to create this event. And thank you to our 16 co-sponsors for spreading the word. You will find them listed with links in the chat later that we will send to all of our attendees. Please take a moment to follow the links and to connect with the valuable work that these co-sponsoring organizations do. In the autumn of 2001, Rachel wrote, "I found the name of the Squiattle of Eld Inlet. I'm quite sure I have never heard the name Squiattle before. I knew about Squaxin Island and Nisqually. I went to a relatively progressive elementary school, and we had speakers from the tribes and ate traditional food and built popsicle stick longhouses. But I grew up in Eld Inlet, literally in it, in the inlet, in the creek, in the mud, amongst the salmon. And did I hear that name at any point, Squiattle? I need to know whose creek that is." Our family home is on the land and waters of the Squiattle, who lived on the shores of Eld Inlet until the Treaty of Medicine Creek in 1864 robbed them of their lands. I understand my responsibility as a visitor on these lands to learn the history, to protect the waters, and to lend support to our Squaxin Island tribal neighbors, of which the Squiattle are a part. Writing to her dad on March 12, 2003 from Gaza, Rachel said, "I would like to leave Rafah with a viable plan to return. I really don't want to live with a lot of guilt about this place, being able to come and go so easily and not going back. I think it is valuable to make commitments to places." A primary goal of the Rachel Corrie Foundation for Peace and Justice is to further Rachel's commitment to the people of Gaza. We need your help to do so. 100% of your donations tonight will benefit the Gaza Community Mental Health Program, GCMHP. Dr. Yasser Abu-Jammeh, the program's executive director, wrote to me this week and said, "It touches me that you decided to designate donations coming from a great event commemorating one of Palestine's heroes to go to GCMHP. To me, such support is not only financial, but also a moral one. It sends a message that Gaza is still in the hearts and minds of people from the international community. This feeling was shaded by the increased COVID-related travel restrictions that made very few people able to visit and show solidarity in person. The donations will support our core activities, providing mental health intervention to those mostly in need and building the capacities of staff working in the field. The demands are increasing, especially after COVID and the May offensive. Your support is important so that our work can continue. So I would ask all of you to please go to our online donation page in the chat or at the Rachel Corrie Foundation website and to help out with any amount that you can. Our co-hosts, the Madison Rafah Sister City Project, are a committed group who also host an annual Rachel Corrie observance in their community of Madison, Wisconsin. Due to COVID limitations, we're glad to have joined forces again this year to create tonight's virtual gathering. Our Madison colleagues Barbara Olson and Cassandra Dixon will share remembrances of two Palestinians with whom they have ties and whose lives were taken earlier this year. Barbara?
Okay, thank you, Cindy. I assume everyone can hear me. Tonight, as Cindy said, we wanted to also commemorate the lives of two other people who have been recently killed by Israel. Omar Assad was a 78-year-old Palestinian American store owner who had lived and raised his family in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for many years. 11 years ago, he and his wife Nasmia retired to his home village of Jiljilia, which is near Ramallah. At 2 a.m. on January 12th, Israeli soldiers were randomly stopping Palestinians in Jiljilia. They pulled Omar out of his car as he returned from visiting relatives. They abused him and then dumped him blindfolded, gagged, and with his hands zip-tied behind his back at an empty construction site. After the soldiers left, other detained Palestinians found Omar lying face down, unconscious, with a plastic zip tie still on one wrist and a blindfold over his eyes. Doctors found that he died of a heart attack, which was caused directly by the violence that he experienced. Since he was a US citizen, the State Department was pressured to ask Israel for an investigation. So far, the result of that investigation has been a whitewash, and Israel has issued very minor penalties to 3 of the soldiers for having suffered a, quote, moral lapse, unquote. This is not accountability, and it's certainly not justice. The Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem has issued a detailed and damning report on Omar's case, and you can find it online. But tonight we wanted to remember Omar as his family and friends knew him. In the words of his wife, Nazmiya, he was, quote, warm, kind, well-liked, helpful, generous, and resourceful, with a good sense of humor. There's hardly anyone in the village, young or old, who didn't know Haj Omar, or Abu Hani as they called him. He was sociable and regularly attended people's celebrations and days of mourning. I miss him, she continued, and so do all the residents of the village and the area. His daughter Hala wrote, all his life, my father strove to lead a good and simple life. He always greeted his customers with a warm smile and a joke. Nothing was more important to him than his family. He communicated to his children on a daily basis his deep love for all of us and his hopes and dreams for our futures. He always used to tell us, always show people respect. My father always strove to do good and be of use in the modest businesses he owned in Wisconsin, in how he raised his children, in how he lived his life. He always wanted to help others and have a positive impact. So tonight we join with Omar Assad's family and call on the US State Department to do its own investigation and to demand real accountability. Maybe then Omar's goal of doing good might be furthered in death as it was in life. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Cassandra Dixon, who is going to talk about Haj Suleiman, who was killed around the same time in the West Bank.
As a volunteer in the South Hebron Hills, I was so fortunate to meet Haj Suleiman and witness his extraordinary commitment to his people and his country. Haj Suleiman Hathlin was born around 1949 in the village of Tel Arad in the northern Negev desert. During the Nakba in 1948, his community was forced to flee their homes, and his family moved with their flocks to land his father bought in the Bedouin community of Al-Khair in Masafer Yatta in the South Hebron Hills. On January 5th, Haj Suleiman was standing at the side of the road protesting an Israeli seizure of village vehicles when an Israeli settler working for the Israeli police deliberately struck him with a tow truck and dragged him for several meters without stopping. He died from those injuries on January 17th. Since the 1980s, Israelis from the illegal settlement of Carmel have been taking more and more and more land from the village, demolishing Palestinian homes, animal barns, farm fields, toilets, and wells. Haj Suleiman was a constant presence at these demonstrations and demolitions, and always showed up against the seizure of Palestinian land there and throughout the West Bank. He had been arrested, beaten, and detained dozens of times. He had incredible energy. He insisted that his family take him everywhere that there were demolitions or demonstrations happening, and he always arrived smiling, moving so quickly to that spot between the people and the soldiers that it seemed like he could fly. He always put himself between the soldiers and the younger people. He was patient and disciplined, deeply nonviolent, and without fear. He had respect for only one authority, and that was God's. An incredibly kind man, he welcomed everyone and had time for everyone. He loved his large family and his village very much. Knowing that people were stressed and afraid, he was always very reassuring to everyone around him, even amidst the most terrible and sad events. He had suffered so much loss and injury himself, but was always comforting to everyone around him. His death has left his family and his village and the entire West Bank with a terrible sadness and deprived the world of a fierce advocate for justice and humanity. Now, the enormous burden of personal risk and resistance that he shouldered so graciously has fallen to his children and grandchildren and to all of us who were fortunate to meet him while he was with us.
Thank you, Barb and Cassandra. Our support for the Gaza Community Health Program tonight will be provided in remembrance of Rachel, Omar Assad, and Haj Suleiman, and with conscious awareness of all the loss that is associated with this issue. We are fortunate to have 5 knowledgeable guests to share their work and perspectives on holding Israel accountable and how we can most effectively pursue peace with justice for Palestinians and Israelis. Welcome to our panelists, Lubna Alzaroo, Katherine Gallagher, Josh Ruebner, and Muhammad Sankari, and to our moderator for the evening, Phyllis Bennis. Phyllis is a fellow of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. She is a longtime activist and analyst on Israel-Palestine, other Middle East and U.S. war issues, and helped found the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Phyllis is currently on the board of Jewish Voice for Peace and has worked closely with UN officials on Palestine. She was shortlisted twice to become the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Palestine. Since 2003, Phyllis has been a mentor and friend whose knowledge and insight I often rely upon. She will now provide an overview of the evening's topics and moderate the discussion and Q&A with our panelists. Phyllis.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you all for joining us tonight. Thanks to the Rachel Corrie Foundation for Peace and Justice and the Madison Sister City program. For all of us, this is an important night to be sharing together. You know, history, as we understand it, is very much shaped by when you start the clock. In 2003, on March 16th, the clock stopped with Rachel's death. It was also just hours from the beginning of the US war in Iraq. I think for many of us, those two events will always be connected in our minds. If we look back further, in 1968, on March 16th, the My Lai massacre took place in Vietnam, something that shaped a whole generation's understanding of what that war was about. And if we come forward again to just last year in 2021, March 16th was the day that 6 Asian women were massacred in Atlanta in a spate of anti-Asian violence. Today, we see a clock that has stopped with the war in Ukraine, a humanitarian disaster with the danger of escalation, even potentially to the ultimate danger of a nuclear exchange. We see the urgency of diplomacy in that war, an immediate ceasefire, a pullback of Russian forces, negotiations over neutrality, and an end to NATO's involvement with Ukraine, all of those things. And the question of the urgency of now, is still very much part of Rachel's legacy. Every year in the United Nations, there is a commemoration of the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people on November 29th. On the year that Rachel was killed in 2003, I was invited to address the General Assembly on that day. It was a time when we were challenging the United Nations for not holding Israel accountable. And I described Rachel's work. I described how her work was necessary, and the work of internationals as well as the Palestinian activists themselves was all necessary because the United Nations had failed to hold Israel accountable, and how there were too many Palestinians, along with Rachel, who were being killed while working for Palestinian rights. Here's a bit of what I said that night. I said, our civil society organizations are very, very proud of Rachel Corrie and of the nonviolent movement of which she was a part, and which carries out its work today in her name. But our pride is not enough. We are determined to fight for a truly international protection force under UN authority which would make sacrifices such as Rachel's unnecessary. We are sobered by the recognition that as of today, the Palestinian people can still not yet count on such a commitment by the United Nations. And so the work, and sometimes the sacrifices, of these brave young internationals continues, along with those of the Palestinians they work with. We know that Rachel's legacy has joined with Palestine's legacy in that urgency of now. We have many lessons for our movement that we have learned through Rachel's legacy. And as we share the horror of this latest war in Ukraine, seeing the largest refugee flow in Europe since World War II, we are thinking about how to build solidarity with today's new refugees while continuing to lift up the memories of the Nakba, when 750,000 Palestinians were turned into refugees overnight, when they were driven out of their homes. 80% of the population of Gaza, where Rachel gave so much of her work and her love and her life. 80% of the people of Gaza are descended from those refugees. We are learning the lessons, and we are learning lessons for our movement on how to challenge the double standards of how this war is viewed, how refugees are being viewed this time around, while recognizing that this is how all refugees should be treated. This is how all wars should be opposed. This is how all civil society campaigns against wars and occupations and apartheid should be welcomed by governments. These are all part of the lessons of Rachel's legacy. How do we respond to the immediate humanitarian crisis of war and refugee flows and still keep the focus on accountability for those responsible for those disasters? Rachel's legacy teaches us that we have to hold Israel accountable, both structurally, as we've seen lately in the Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch reports on apartheid as a crime against humanity, and personally accountable for those Israelis who are responsible for the acts that make up those crimes, as the International Criminal Court is holding or investigating the possibility of holding individuals responsible for commission of those crimes. Tonight, we are going to hear from several extraordinary speakers from our movements whose work goes directly to this question of Israeli accountability. Accountability under international law, accountability as the focus of global civil society campaigns, accountability or lack thereof of the United States government, and the accountability demanded by Palestinians who are themselves challenging occupation, apartheid, and colonialism. Our first speaker tonight is Lubna Alzaroo, who grew up in Hebron in Palestine before she moved to the Seattle area for graduate school. Lubna has a PhD in English literature, and she is currently working on the faculty of the University of Washington. Her research focuses on the connections between settler colonial infrastructure, necropolitics, and the environment in the United States and Palestinian context. Lubna.
Thank you, Phyllis. Hi, everyone. I want to first start by thanking the Rachel Corrie Foundation for inviting me to participate in this panel on this very important day. And thank you also to everyone who helped put this event together. I want to start actually by acknowledging that I reside on the unceded ancestral lands of the Duwamish people, a people that are still here, continuing to honor and bring light to their ancient heritage. Today, as part of the event theme, Holding Israel Accountable, I'm going to be talking about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement as a way to hold Israel accountable. I think it's particularly relevant to discuss BDS today as it relates to the current moment with the war on the Ukraine and the global movement to boycott Russia that is underway. I also will briefly address attempts to censor the movement and I will say the futility of those attempts. To give some context about me, as part of my scholarly work, I am interested in studying settler colonialism, particularly settler colonial states as systems and infrastructures that are entrenched. Often when we think of settler colonialism, we think about its violence, we think of genocide, we think of its systems of discrimination. But for me, what's more interesting is the way it entangles itself in every infrastructure to the extent that it becomes hard for the native to imagine how to entangle themselves from it. Israeli colonization of Palestine is very much that. Australian scholar Patrick Wolfe, in his seminal work, Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Native, said that settler colonialism is a structure, not just an event. That elimination is an organizing principle of settler colonial society rather than a one-off occurrence. Therefore, if we think of Israeli settler colonialism as governed by structures, then I think it takes a fluid and unstructured movement to help unravel it. And to me, BDS has always been such a movement. So I remember the day a friend introduced me to BDS. It was 2009. This is a really vivid memory. We were actually in a bathroom at Bethlehem University. I was drying my hands and I was just telling her how I felt hopeless about the situation in Palestine. This is a friend who is Jewish American. I was telling her that nothing seemed to be working to end the occupation. I was obviously feeling very down that day. She asked me then if I had thought of the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. And I had never actually heard of the movement before she told me about it in 2009. So when she told me more about it, it was sort of hard for me to imagine that this is a movement that could gain traction. She did encourage me to look at South Africa and how it helped there. And over the years, as time has gone by, to me, BDS as a way to hold Israel accountable has felt more effective than any other movement, precisely because, as I mentioned earlier, how fluid it is, the fact that it is very much built as a grassroots movement, the fact that it's not dependent on one leader, that it holds within it and can hold within it people with differing opinion and political ideologies. No movement, for example, I believe that no movement that is centered around Israeli occupation has had as much of a strong agreement and participation from different Palestinian civil society organizations like the BDS movement in Palestine. The movement itself is reliant on networks and coalitions, which has made it impossible for the Israelis to dismantle it the way that they have been able to with other Palestinian resistant movements, unfortunately. So since its inception in 2005, the BDS movement has grown in unexpected ways and gained victories in places we all thought impossible. And it's precisely because of that that the Zionists are using every tactic possible to try and discredit it. I remember, just to mention some of those victories, I remember, for example, when the campaign to boycott Ben & Jerry's started around 2010 because of their business with settlements. I remember the activists who were working on this and how sort of exhausted they were feeling about these attempts. But then finally last summer, Ben & Jerry's announced its decision to pull out of Israeli settlements, despite immense pressure on them not to do so, even from their own parent company, Unilever. And then during Israel's 2021 attack on Gaza, Israeli ships were prevented from docking in ports across the world, including here in Seattle. Students' associations around the world have also voted to support divestment. Scholars are boycotting Israeli educational institutions. And more recently, Irish writer Sally Rooney refused to allow her book to be published by an Israeli company. These are all things that I think in 2009, when I was first introduced to BDS, I would have thought impossible for them to happen. And also to briefly go back to even the Gaza attack, the attack on Gaza, the Israeli attack on Gaza in 2021. Despite my devastation over the loss of Palestinian lives that year, one thing that I did notice is that during those events that there was a serious shift in the narratives around Palestine in the media here in the US, but especially in social media too. I think also that Israel noticed that shift and that there is now a stronger resistant movement to its colonization of Palestine around the world. But, I think that sort of made it so that their attack on Gaza ended quicker than what is considered the norm for them. So, so in reference to all of that, I think that the BDS movement over the years has contributed to this shifting narrative around the occupation. There are challenges, however, and I don't want to go into them extensively because I think it's important to focus on what works, but I do want to mention just two things because they relate to what we need to do to hold Israel accountable. I see the biggest challenge to the BDS movement currently is actually Israel's normalization with Arab countries that I'm sure a lot of you have heard about. Obviously, there's all their attempts to make the movement also illegal here in the US. And I do know that currently the movement is attempting to build a stronger coalition in Arab countries to resist these normalization attempts. And so it's now more important than ever for us here in the US to work on strengthening the movement, especially in the face of attempts to delegitimize and discredit BDS here. You can also see these attempts to discredit the movement in the US context, even if you just Google BDS, for example. So if you Google BDS, the first 5 entries that will appear are all ones funded by Zionist organizations such as Stand With Us. They are, by the way, sponsored ads, so they are paying to have them appear as top search results because obviously they don't want the top search results to be the BDS movement website. We can also see it in the way they've tried to discredit vocal BDS leaders such as Omar and when that failed, using their influence to get him blocked from visiting places, including UK and the US. So basically attempting to suppress his voice. In 2019, Omar Barghouti was actually denied a visa to the US by the Trump administration. And also Israel has gone as far as refusing to renew his travel documents. In the US, the delegitimization of the BDS movement by members of the House and Senate also continues, which is why I see the importance of this current moment where the Biden administration has implemented sanctions against Russia in response to its invasion of the Ukraine. So what we are currently seeing with Russia is a boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement at work. So in the past 2 weeks alone, 330 companies have withdrawn from Russia, not to mention the cultural boycotts, the limitation on Russia's oil exports, as well as restricting its access to SWIFT banking system. The Biden administration and the European Union keep talking about implementing further sanctions on Russia, and we even have Republicans telling the Biden administration that they aren't doing enough. Which is sort of really ironic, and that Biden needs to implement further sanctions. The legitimization of sanctions in this context opens up the door, I think, for the Palestinian BDS movement to accomplish more things than ever before. And I'm not the only one observing this and the potential of this current moment here. In an opinion piece in Mondoweiss 2 days ago, Marian Kawas asks, and I'm quoting here, does the Zionist lobby think that they can carry on with their anti-BDS bashing as usual once the Ukraine crisis is no longer in the news? Or are we witnesses a qualitative shift in the making that will preempt that? I think it is worth thinking about these questions today as we think of ways to hold Israel accountable. That it's important for us as a cross-solidarity movement to end Israeli colonization to think of how to build on this current moment. Pointing the hypocrisy of US government narratives around Ukraine and BDS is all fine and well, but how do we go beyond that? How can we use the legitimization of BDS in the Russian context to fight bills and laws that attempt to delegitimize BDS in the Palestinian context? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lubna. This was a great discussion of BDS, and I think it's a great segue for our next speaker. Our next speaker is Katie Gallagher, a senior staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights, where she works on seeking redress for victims and survivors. I think, Katie, I'm not sure your picture is up yet.
I'm here, Phyllis.
Okay, there you are. Katie works on seeking redress for victims and survivors and holding government officials and corporations accountable for egregious human rights violations in US courts, as well as before human rights bodies and at the International Criminal Court. Among the cases that Katie has litigated here are Corrie versus Caterpillar, which I think most people here will be familiar with, Matar versus Dichter, which involves a war crimes trial against a former top Israeli intelligence official, and Silber versus Airbnb, one of the BDS-related cases. Katie currently represents victims in the situations of Palestine and Afghanistan, which includes investigation of US torture at the International Criminal Court. Katie.
Thank you, Phyllis. And I join in thanking the Rachel Corrie Foundation for inviting me to be here tonight. It is a somber remembrance, but such an important one, so thank you. I'm going to speak about accountability for Israeli officials at the International Criminal Court. And in giving this presentation, I really want to emphasize that while it is a milestone of sorts that there is now an investigation of the state of Palestine and crimes committed on its territory at the ICC. This is but one piece of a long-standing effort of accountability against Israel and Israeli officials in courts at the national levels, before human rights bodies. And this work has been built by the Palestinians on the ground who have witnessed, who have been victims of, who have documented, who have told the stories of crimes committed in the course of not only the occupation, but the entire settler colonial enterprise. So I just want to put the ICC effort in that historical context and again emphasize that it is a piece, an important piece, but one that continues to go on. So to start with, I want to give a little bit of background about what the International Criminal Court is. It's how it exercises its jurisdiction. Then I'll briefly touch on how the situation in Palestine came to be before the court and where things stand now. So the International Criminal Court was set up by the Rome Treaty, the Rome Statute in 1998, and the court came into being in 2002. The ICC is in fact a criminal court, and it exercises jurisdiction over individuals. So this would not be a place where you would bring a case against the state of Israel, but rather against Israeli officials. Cases against Israel as a state would be brought at the International Court of Justice, which is down the street from the ICC in The Hague. And in fact, today we saw a decision come out from the ICJ in the context of Russia and Ukraine on the application of the crime of genocide. So I think the ICJ is another venue, but right now I'm just focusing on the ICC. So this court can exercise jurisdiction either over the nationals of states that have become a party, or for crimes committed on the territory of any of the 123 member states. It can also exercise jurisdiction if a non-member state makes a referral, which is what Ukraine has done, or if the Security Council refers a situation. So it's not a global court, but it is one that covers a large swath of the world at this point with 123 member states. So Palestine first tried to go to the ICC in 2009 after Operation Cast Lead, the assault on Gaza back in December 2008 and January 2009 that resulted in the death of more than 1,400 Palestinians. At that time, the ICC declined to open an investigation because it said that there was a question about whether or not Palestine was a state. In 2012, the General Assembly granted Palestine or recognized Palestine's status as a non-member observer state. So once that General Assembly recognition happened, Palestine then was in a position to ratify international treaties. And what we saw happen in 2014, the 51-day assault on Gaza, so-called Operation Protective Edge, in the midst of that, that offensive, the prosecutor said that at this stage, she wasn't quite sure whether she could exercise jurisdiction. Civil society in Palestine were documenting cases, sending them to the International Criminal Court, and calling on Palestine to ratify the treaty. And on January 1st, 2015, Palestine did in fact ratify the ICC Rome Statute, and thus gave the International Criminal Court jurisdiction over its territory for when the crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes were committed. And it gave that jurisdiction back to June 2014, so that the ICC does have jurisdiction over the 2014 military assault. And then there were many years that nothing happened, despite the fact that Palestine was a member. Palestinian civil society continued to press the prosecutor of the ICC to open an investigation. And for many years, it stayed in what's called the preliminary examination stage. And finally, in December 2019, the prosecutor said, yes, there is a reasonable basis to open an investigation. She made that conclusion based on reporting and fact-finding by Palestinian human rights organizations, by Israeli human rights organizations, by UN commissions of inquiry, by victims' testimony that was provided to her. As much of this audience knows, the crimes committed on the occupied Palestinian territory are amongst the most well-documented in the world. So this is not a difficult conclusion for the prosecutor to have come to, although it took 5 years. She did, however, say that because of all the attention and the criticism about the potential opening of an investigation, she wanted to be sure of her jurisdiction. So she sent a question to the pretrial chamber to confirm that the territory of Palestine, in fact, included the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. So she wanted to firm up and have confirmed what the territory of Palestine actually was that was under her jurisdiction. And that question then was open to briefing. I represent Palestinian victims of the crime against humanity of persecution. That means it's a crime that's committed on a widespread or systematic basis, directed at a civilian population because of who they are, their nationality, their ethnicity, their race. In this case, it's because they are Palestinian and they're denied fundamental rights. And the victims that I represent have been denied the right to life, the right to health, the right to education, the right to family, the right to travel and movement, especially Palestinians that I represent from the Gaza Strip. And we said to the pretrial chamber, yes, of course, the jurisdiction of Palestine includes West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. And we waited another year before the pretrial chamber confirmed that indeed the ICC does have jurisdiction, and that is the territory that the prosecutor can investigate. And on March 3rd, 2021, the former prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, formally opened an investigation. Now, I've covered many years of efforts to even have the ICC exercise its jurisdiction. And over the course of those years, there have been multiple military assaults. And that is, I haven't even mentioned yet the assault last May on Gaza and what has been happening in Sheikh Jarrah. And then we have the daily assault on Palestinian civilians, whether it's through home demolitions, whether it's through arrests and detentions or killings, as we saw at the start of the evening tonight. So this investigation has been open for a year, but there are not yet any cases that have been brought. The ICC tends to bring its cases against those who bear the greatest responsibility. That would be leaders of the government or the military. That tends to be who is targeted. The ICC cannot exercise jurisdiction over corporations, but it also can look at those maybe who are providing financing or furthering, aiding and abetting the commission of war crimes. We don't know yet who the ICC might bring individual cases against, if anyone. At this moment, Palestinians are still submitting evidence and pressing for the opening of an investigation, the opening of actual cases at the ICC. The current prosecutor, Karim Khan, has spoken of the fact that he has very limited resources and a lot to do. And this is before the situation that we see unfolding, the horrors that we see unfolding in Ukraine. And he has made repeated calls over the last weeks to get increased funding. Thankfully, he has said for all situations. And I think this is a moment where we as civil society, those of us who want to see investigations proceed at a faster pace, and investigations not in an end in of themselves, but to prevent the commission of more crimes. This is a moment to say that the ICC should have the support it needs. The United States has taken a contrary position. The United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court. And in fact, after the opening of the investigation into the situation of Palestine, and the opening of an investigation into the situation of Afghanistan, which, as Phyllis mentioned, also includes torture by Americans on Afghani territory. The Trump administration had placed the former prosecutor on a sanctions list. Today, however, the United States Senate, in a bipartisan resolution, issued its support for the work of the International Criminal Court in the context of Ukraine. So again, as Lubna mentioned, we are seeing some double standards, but this may also be an opportunity for us to say, no, we need equal access to justice. We need the equal application of the law. All civilians deserve the protections of the Geneva Conventions, and all who, regardless of their power, who violate the law need to be held to account. So we are hopeful that there will be some renewed support for all investigations at the ICC, because justice and accountability for Palestinians has been too long delayed, and with that delay has come too many crimes and the loss of too many lives. So I will leave it there.
Thank you, Katie. That was an extraordinary tour through the history of the potential and limitations of the International Criminal Court. And it leads directly to our next speaker, Josh Ruebner, who will be addressing the US side of this broad question of accountability. Josh is the Director of Government Relations for the Institute for Middle East Understanding and is also an adjunct lecturer in Justice and Peace Studies at Georgetown University. He's currently pursuing his PhD at the European Center for Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter, and is the author of Shattered Hopes, Obama's Failure to Broker Israeli-Palestinian Peace, and Israel, Democracy or Apartheid State. Josh is a former analyst in Middle East affairs at the Congressional Research Service. Thanks, Josh. Go ahead.
Thanks so much, Phyllis, and thank you to Cindy and Craig and the Rachel Corrie Foundation for inviting me here tonight. I remember first meeting Cindy and Craig at a protest outside the Israeli embassy just a few days after Rachel was killed, as they began their process of seeking justice and accountability for their unfathomable loss. As we mark the 19th year since Rachel was killed, it remains an indelible stain on our government's record that Israel still has not been held accountable in any way for its killing of this brave young soul who took a stand to defend a Palestinian home from being demolished by a Caterpillar D9 bulldozer, a weapon paid for by public funds and sent to an army engaging in a belligerent military occupation for the purpose of committing a war crime. As the United States rightfully holds accountable the Russian government for its criminal and savage attack on Ukraine and its military occupation of parts of its territory, this lack of accountability toward Israel is more glaring than ever. Israel must be held accountable because impunity fosters a sense of entitlement and even greater brazenness in committing further atrocities. Since an Israeli soldier killed Rachel 19 years ago today, Israeli troops also executed US citizen Furkan Doğan on board a ship attempting to deliver humanitarian relief to Palestinians blockaded in the Gaza Strip, and shot and killed US citizen Mahmoud Sha'alan as he was walking away from a checkpoint in the West Bank. Israel has also grievously wounded Brian Avery, Tristan Anderson, and Emily Hanachowitz, brutally beat teenager Tarek Abu Khadir, and, as was mentioned earlier, in January, dragged 78-year-old Omar Assad from his car, bound and gagged him, and threw him on a cold floor to die. Despite the US citizenship of Rachel, Furkan, Mahmoud, Brian, Tristan, Emily, and Omar, the US government failed miserably in its duty to hold Israel accountable. And it goes without saying that the US has also failed to hold Israel accountable for its daily injustices, indignities, and crimes committed against millions of Palestinians, something which is just as urgent and necessary. Contrast the rapidity with which the US has moved to hold Russia accountable for its aggression against Ukraine with the nearly 75 years the US has bankrolled and backed Israel's ongoing Nakba against the Palestinian people, a devastating and interlocking system of settler colonialism, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and military occupation. Israel must be held accountable for the individual crimes it commits in particular, and for its illegitimate rule over the Palestinian people in general. The good news is that we already have all the tools we need to hold Israel accountable. In the case of Omar Assad, we know the name of the unit responsible for his killing, Netzach Yehuda. According to the Leahy laws, this unit must be sanctioned for committing acts of torture and extrajudicial killings, and the individuals responsible must be denied US visas. We have the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, which empowers the US government to sanction foreign officials responsible for human rights abuses. The Arms Export Control Act is supposed to limit the use of US weapons by other countries to legitimate self-defense and internal policing only, and to deny those countries US weapons when they are used for other illegitimate purposes. And the Foreign Assistance Act is supposed to cut off all forms of US support to a country that engages in a systematic pattern of gross human rights violations. The tools for holding Israel accountable are there. What is lacking is the political will to employ them, both 19 years ago when Rachel was killed and today. However, Israel's carefully constructed image and pretensions to democracy are withering under a growing consensus of Palestinian, Israeli, US, and international human rights organizations that Israel is guilty of apartheid, a crime against humanity. We must continue as we have been, and as we've already made great strides in doing, in continuing to educate, to organize BDS campaigns, to challenge racist narratives in the media that dehumanize the Palestinian people, so that we build the political will that will finally, belatedly, force our elected officials to hold Israel accountable for its abhorrent crimes against the Palestinian people, with whom Rachel Corrie stood in solidarity. Of course, building that political will among decision makers is easier said than done. If we had a magic formula for doing it, we would have implemented it a long time ago. And although we don't have that magic formula, please allow me a few observations based on more than 20 years of working for Palestinian rights in Washington, D.C., in the hope that these observations can help us build the political power we need to hold Israel accountable. Number one, start early. There's a very good reason why Israel lobby organizations cultivate decision makers at the state and even the local level. They know that future members of Congress often come from these ranks. And by the time these decision makers reach Washington, D.C., they're already embedded within an Israel lobby worldview. It's never too early to start educating and pressing candidates and elected officials to act in support of Palestinian rights. Number two, challenge the platitudes. Knowledge about Israel and its policies toward the Palestinian people is incredibly surface level, even among the most hardcore pro-Israel members of Congress. Their threadbare talking points just don't hold up to any scrutiny at all. Look at the furious reaction that we've seen to the recent Amnesty International report. Of the more than 80 members of Congress who condemned the report, almost none of them actually tried to engage with the substance of it because they couldn't rebut it. So without repeating opposition talking points, which is something that only reinforces them, we need to consistently challenge their platitudes with a sharp focus on the ways in which Israel practices apartheid. Number three, institutionalized power building. For a long time, people who supported Palestinian rights and wanted to get involved in electoral work had to do so as individuals. That is no longer the case. Palestinian rights organizations are increasingly diving into the electoral arena and having successes in doing that. It's worth noting that politicians are now seeking out their endorsements, adopting Palestinian rights in their platform as a reflection of their progressive values and as part of a progressive formula to get elected. This is a seismic shift in the electoral landscape, and we should support it. Number four, get your people in place. This was advice I received from a high-level congressional staffer for an extremely pro-Israel member of Congress many, many years ago during the Second Intifada. I rather naively assumed that if this staffer only understood the immorality of Israel's extrajudicial assassinations and home demolitions, then this member of Congress would take better positions. He cut me off and he told me, if you don't like our positions, then spend the next 20 years getting your people into place. I took that advice to heart. And while we are indeed starting to get our people into place, we still have a long way to go. Lastly, number five, get involved in decision-making bodies. Democracy is not a spectator sport, and you have to be at the table where decisions are made in order to affect them. So join your local political party, take a leadership position in it, run for school board, city council, and even Congress. Why not you? We are all that we need. We don't need to wait for others to implement the changes that we want to see. So in summary, the way forward is to continue building our political power strategically in order to create the political will necessary to utilize our existing tools to hold Israel accountable for its injustices. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Josh. A great sort of tour through what's required to change the political landscape. As we know, it has changed enormously in recent years. The polls bear that out. All of these discourse shifts that are underway, many of them come back to our movements, and we can be attributing them to the work of our movements. So this is really crucial. Our final panelist tonight, Mohammed Sankari, will be talking about the question of Israeli accountability from the vantage point of Palestinians themselves and their organizing. Mohammed is the current lead organizer at the Arab American Action Network, AAAN, in Chicago, where he started as an AmeriCorps volunteer in 2010. He helps to guide their youth-led campaign to end racial profiling, which focuses on combating law enforcement repression against Arab and Muslim communities in Chicagoland. Mohammed is also a volunteer leader of the Chicago chapter of the U.S. Palestinian Community Network, USPCN, and his work there focuses on political prisoners advocacy and Black Palestinian unity. Mohammed, it's on you.
Thank you, Phyllis. Of course, thank you to Cindy and Craig for having us here, and thank you to all the panelists who spoke before me. My name is Mohammed again. I'm with the U.S. Palestinian Community Network, and I'm based in Chicago. USPCN is a national Arab and Palestinian organization working to revitalize grassroots organizing around Palestinian liberation here in the United States. We have chapters across the country, including Los Angeles, San Francisco, Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, New York, and DC, just to name a few. We have multiple areas of focus, including a defense of Palestinian political prisoners, providing political defense for those who come under attack here in the United States, such as Rasmi Aouda, preserving our arts and culture, and of course, being a part of the broader BDS movement. And the work of USPCN is guided by what Palestinians and Arabs call the thawabit, or the constants of the Palestinian struggle, which is the right to national liberation for the Palestinian people, the right of return for all Palestinian refugees and their descendants to their original homes and lands, and the end of the colonization and Zionization of all Palestinian and Arab land. So I really want to start by talking about what we call unity in action, or some have called solidarity. And I want to talk about USPCN's important role alongside the Black liberation movement and the movement for Black lives in its more recent iteration in this country. I want to start there. So USPCN, we're lucky in that we have historic ties to the Black liberation movement in this country that were really founded by our elders. These were Palestinian immigrants who came in the 1960s and 70s and organized alongside the Black Panthers, the Puerto Rican independence movement, the Chicano liberation movement. And that's what laid this foundation that, my generation has been able to build upon. And this is really based in an ideological link that understands anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, and the link between the importance of fighting against Israeli colonization and Zionism and the national oppression of people like Black people and Puerto Ricans and Chicanos and Native Americans and others within this country. And within the more recent generation and the recent iteration of what we've called the Black Lives Matter movement, USPCN has played a role in before and since the assassination of Mike Brown, the murder of Mike Brown, in which USPCN took a delegation of 30 Arab and Palestinian youth to march in what they called the Ferguson summer demonstrations. And in Chicago, we sit on the steering committee of one of the most important Black-led organizations in the city, the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, which is part of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Oppression, which grew out of the movement to free Angela Davis, and currently is leading the fight against what we call police crimes, and fighting for an all-civilian, all-elected Police Accountability Council here in Chicago, a complete civilian takeover of the Chicago Police Department. So why all of this? Why am I providing this as context? And why does this matter to holding Israel accountable? Well, what I want to offer is that if we want to think about holding Israel accountable from the United States, it takes a broad strategic alliance of multiple organizations, multiple nationalities, multiple groups of people that are coming together to fight against racism, Zionism, colonization, amongst many other issues. And for us to be in deep solidarity with one another, beyond transactional solidarity, beyond speaking only in words on social media or putting the Black Lives Matter hashtag in our tweets, but thinking about how do we at a true community-based level move our people into unified action with one another. And in Chicago, that looks like elders from the Palestinian immigrant community and Arab American youth fighting hand in hand, as I mentioned before, for the fight against police crimes and for police accountability. And it also looks like members from the Black Liberation Movement taking Palestine front and center and making no concessions when it comes to Palestine because of the deep links that we've been able to build with one another. And so I want to talk a little bit about our vision of what it means and our understanding of what it means to hold Israel accountable from the United States. And I want to start by saying that it's not only about the government of Israel. We need to recognize that we are living within the country that is the largest financial, political, economic, and multiple other means supporters of the state of Israel, the United States government. And we also need to recognize that it's about, as a panelist before me had mentioned, about also holding the reactionary Arab regimes who are normalizing with Israel and exposing them for what they are in this moment. And so we take a number of approaches to that. And I want to talk about two areas of our work in specific. The first is our work on HR 2590, which some may know as the Palestinian Children's Families Act or the Betty McCollum bill. And I just want to take a moment to mention that the HR 2590 is not going to lead to the liberation of Palestine, nor do we believe that it will. But the importance of HR 2590 is understanding that what we want to do is to demand in the United States political landscape that you cannot be a progressive within the United States if you are not willing to do the absolute bare minimum to uphold the rights of the Palestinian people. And that's why HR 2590 is important. That's why we've targeted Congressperson Correa in SoCal, Congressperson Dingell in Michigan, Congressperson Moore in Wisconsin, Congressperson Bowman in New York, who signed on, but then went on a Zionist delegation to Palestine and spoke against BDS. Why we've pressured Barbara Lee in Northern California, and why in Chicago, we've targeted one of the most progressive current people in Congress, Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky. Congresswoman Schakowsky, for those who may not know, again, is a progressive as much as a progressive as any congressperson is, and one of the most progressive congresspeople when it comes to issues of immigration, labor rights, women's rights, LGBT rights, civil rights. Congresswoman Schakowsky is very well known and outspoken. She's a who's who of every progressive function in the city of Chicago. However, she has not taken the bare minimum stance for the Palestinian people. And so what we've done is demanded of Congresswoman Schakowsky that you can no longer, in our community, in our state, in the state that has the largest Palestinian diaspora within the United States, you can no longer call yourself a progressive if you will not do the absolute bare minimum in upholding the human rights of the Palestinian people. HR 2590 is calling for the bare minimum that our tax dollars don't go to criminalize and imprison Palestinian children and expropriate land from the Palestinian people. And so because of that, we've staged sit-ins at Congresswoman Schakowsky's office. We've bombarded her office with phone calls and emails. We've bird-dogged her at her very own events. And this has been done alongside the allies that I spoke about earlier. Some call it solidarity. We like to call it unity in action, where our allies from the immigrant rights movement, the labor movement, the Black liberation movement, the Chicana liberation movement in this city are standing side by side with us, demanding that Congresswoman Schakowsky sign on to HR 2590. This is part of the political shift that says you are someone who is seen as a leader in all of our movements, but it is not enough if you do not speak up to do the bare minimum for the Palestinian people. The second thing that I want to offer is the movement around what's been called Stand with the Six. The 6 Palestinian human rights organizations that were designated as terrorists by the Israeli government, And what we've done is demanded that the United States State Department take a firm and public stance denouncing the Israeli designation. And specifically, we've made this demand of Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Israel and Palestinian Affairs, that's the true title within the State Department, Mr. Hadi Amir. Hadi is an Arab American, an Arab immigrant, and who has made his way into the State Department as part of a movement within our community that says we need to engage and work within the system. And so we've demanded that if you have a role within the US State Department and the US government, you need to do the bare minimum and defend the rights of these organizations that are standing up for the human rights of the Palestinian people. And that's why we've made this demand not only of Secretary of State Antony Blinken, but of this Deputy Assistant Secretary, Mr. Hadi Amir. And so the way forward, we believe, we need to keep targeting our reps on bills such as HR 2590 and specifically HR 2590. We need to keep holding people like Hadi Amir and Antony Blinken to task to make public pronouncements in defense of Palestinian human rights organizations currently being criminalized by Israel. And I'll leave you all with why we believe this is so important. There's a woman by the name of Hatem Abudayyeh, who is the head of the General Union of Palestinian Women, who was arrested by the Israelis in November of 2020 and held in administrative detention, which is a temporary essentially detention that can be extended indefinitely without charge. And recently, Hatem Abudayyeh was officially charged and sentenced by the Israeli government because of this designation that the Israeli government made that the General Union of Palestinian Women is one of these organizations that is quote unquote a terrorist organization. And that's why we in the United States, if we want to hold Israel accountable, need to continue to hold the largest supporter of Israel, our own government, accountable to all of the Israeli actions that they are defending and supporting economically and politically. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you to all of our speakers for an amazing amount of content and information and for guidance, I think, for all of us to take from what you've shared. Phyllis and the panel will continue with Q&A momentarily. For those of you in our audience, I think I may have failed to turn on my video. I'm sorry. For those of you in our audience, if you have questions, I'm sure you do, please go to the Q&A and add them. We'll try to answer as many of those as can possibly be answered. I want to remind any of you who might need to leave early that we really urge your support for the Gaza Community Mental Health Program tonight. Please help us to maintain that commitment to Gaza that was so important to Rachel and that remains important to all of us at the Rachel Corrie Foundation and with Madison Rafah Sister City Project. The online donation link is in the chat, also at our website, and we welcome any help in any amount that you can provide. I'd like now to turn it back to Phyllis and to the questions, Q&A.
Thanks, Cindy. This has been an extraordinarily rich set of discussions, and we have lots of questions coming in to the Q&A to take up. What I'm going to do, one of our other colleagues is sorting through the questions, grouping them together. We're not going to be able to get to each question individually in the next 15 or 20 minutes, but we'll try to take as many as we can in groups. If you're about to put in a question, if you have an idea for who in the panel you would like to hear this from, make a note of that. Otherwise, I'll sort of do some checking around. I don't think we have time to have everybody on the panel answer every question, so we'll move around a little bit. The first set of questions has to do with Ukraine, and there's actually 3 separate questions that come in here. The first from Nabil Khouri: how and why were so many companies motivated to support Ukraine in different ways? Is it a coordinated movement or all random? Second, from Rob Normie: given the urgency with which the international community and the ICC have responded to requests from Ukraine, can't the argument be made that the investigation of Israel's alleged crimes must be treated with the same urgency? Is there a legal argument or precedent on this point? And the third, from Malcolm Nazareth: what is Israel's position on the invasion of Ukraine, and what was the significance of Netanyahu's 2020 visit to see Putin in Russia? I think that also may indicate Putin's, the current visit of Bennett to both Ukraine and Russia in the last week, with Israel emerging as a potential negotiating force. So I would say, Katie, perhaps you could start with the ICC questions about whether the issue of Ukraine is going to be able to be used, and if so, how? And then one of the other three of you perhaps take on the question of the US side. I don't know, Josh, maybe you want to take a stab at this one. The US, both political and social / media sides that's influencing this.
Thank you. So just to start, I think it's important to put a little historical context on the situation of Ukraine as well. Ukraine has actually been a situation at the ICC in the early preliminary examination stage since 2014. That is the time when there was attack on protesters in the Maidan in Kiev, as well as at that moment when Eastern Ukraine was invaded by Russian forces and separatist groups. So Ukraine has actually been before the ICC for 8 years. So in some ways, it seems like things are moving very quickly, but it has also been a long effort for Ukrainians. And I think the lesson here is maybe if there had been action by the ICC and resources for the court, including political resources, we wouldn't be where we are right now. I mentioned the fact that the United States had the former prosecutor on a sanctions list. Maybe if the ICC didn't have to spend political capital fighting off US sanctions and arguing about whether or not it could exercise jurisdiction over non-member states, whether the United States, Israel, or Russia, when they commit crimes on the territory of a country that actually wants the ICC there to help protect its civilians, again, we might be in a different situation. But I think where we are now and the equal application of the law, the question asked whether there was any kind of legal requirement. Well, the ICC has to apply international human rights law as well as its core provisions around international criminal law. And a core principle of human rights law is non-discrimination and equal access to justice. So I think this is something that we will be hearing a lot of for victims. And I also want to mention victims in Afghanistan. That is a situation that has been stalled because of lack of resources. And on a daily basis, crimes are being committed against civilians there. So this is a court that is underfunded and it has not received the political cooperation and support that it needs to do a very serious job investigating war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. So I think what we want to see is this moment be one where the principles of international law to protect civilians, to stop aggression, to prevent occupiers from committing crimes against civilians and transferring populations, the same things that we see happening on a daily basis in Palestine, that these principles are actually given effect and enforced. So I think there's a technical piece of getting the ICC the resources it needs so each investigation can continue, but I think it's also on all of us to really put support, make calls for support for the enforcement of existing laws in all situations.
That's great. Thanks, Katie. Josh, and I think we'll have to be a little quicker on answers so we can get to a few more questions. You want to take it briefly, Josh?
Sure, I can't speak to the motivations of why corporations are doing what they're doing, but I will note the fact that the corporate response that we've seen that's targeting all things Russian is something that's much more expansive than what the Palestinian civil society-led BDS campaign has been calling for the last 15 plus years. So to give you one example, for example, Grammarly shut down operations in Russia. So now, honestly, I don't understand how if a Russian person has trouble differentiating between a semicolon and a colon. That's going to change Putin's calculations about whether he should continue the war in Ukraine. In other words, cutting off Grammarly service to Russians doesn't necessarily have any connection to what Russia is doing so barbarically in Ukraine. So I think what we can do at this moment, when there is such this intense and widespread pushback against all things Russian, is also to highlight the very moderate demands of the BDS movement by comparison, where it's calling for specific targeted actions against the Israeli government, against institutions that support the Israeli government, against corporations that are complicit in profiteering from Israel's oppression of the Palestinian people, and targeting cultural and academic institutions and workers that are in partnership with the Israeli government. These are all very, very moderate demands by contrast. And the fact that these boycott, divestment, and sanctions tactics are mushrooming so prolifically regarding Russia and Ukraine, I think actually bodes very well for us to have a renewed boost of action and activity and forward movement on BDS campaigns for Palestine.
Thanks, Josh. Moving on.
Can I?
No, wait, Lubna, because I'm going to come to you next with this question, which is directly related to this. And the question is basically about direct action. I'm not going to read the whole question, but what do people think about direct action, targeting specific companies, et cetera? And I think here we're clearly talking about nonviolent direct action. Lubna, jump on that one.
Sorry, what do you mean by direct actions?
Well, this was the question.
What is the full question? Yeah.
The question, it's looking at examples like in the UK, the grassroots organization Palestine Action has targeted Elbit, et cetera, shut down factories. We are talking about nonviolent direct action in the streets. Just your overall opinion, quickly.
Yeah, I think it's really, I think obviously like these sort of actions are very important. One of the things that I think a lot of times there's a lot of fear around BDS just because of sort of these charges of anti-Semitism. It's known that like if you are a scholar, for example, I'm a scholar, right, at a university. If you're a scholar, then like, and you speak about Israeli apartheid, that you're probably going to have somebody coming after you and all of that. And the reason why the Zionist movement has been so effective in trying to suppress Palestinian voices is because of their direct actions, right? And they are nonviolent actions, right? And so I think like there are lessons to be learned from that, unfortunately, in that like Palestinians and allies also holding as many actions as possible, also making a fuss about things is really important, so that things like the censorship of professors, all these anti-BDS bills that are going through don't keep happening, right? So I think these direct nonviolent actions are very important.
Great, thank you, Lubna. The next question has to do with a variety of attacks on the Palestinian rights movement in the US, on campuses and elsewhere in the UK as well. The effort to get laws passed against BDS, et cetera. So the question is whether the pro-Israel lobby in the US and perhaps Europe as well will ever be challenged or destabilized. And I'm going to ask Mohammed to answer this, but I want to just say one thing first, take my privilege as the moderator, that I think that the question doesn't reflect the fact of how much challenging to the pro-Israeli lobbies of various sorts, because there are many different lobbies supporting Israel, how much of that has already gone on. And we're seeing that in the shift in discourse, in the media, in the public, just beginning at the policy level, but certainly a huge shift if we look back 10 years, if we look back 20 years, from, for example, the beginning of the US campaign for what is now the US campaign for Palestinian rights, where the issue of supporting Israel is now thoroughly a partisan issue in a way that it never used to be. That the polls consistently indicate growing support for Palestinian rights and diminishing support for Israel, calls for the US to reduce the amount of aid it sends to Israel. And I think these shifts are very much a reflection of our movement's challenge to what the pro-Israel lobbies have done. And Mohammed, I want you to jump in on this one and talk about how the Palestinian communities across the US are engaged in that work as well.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Phyllis. I think this is an important question. And the first thing that I want to point out, I think that's important when we talk about the Israeli lobby, is I think it's very important to think about why they are so successful. And a key part of it, there's an old adage that says the tail doesn't wag the dog, right? We need to understand the role that Israel plays for the United States in the region and has historically played politically for the United States in the region. And so we're talking about as a colonial outpost, essentially, to be frank, for the United States. And so it's not a surprise then that when you have right-wing and conservative members of government who are supporting, in general, US expansionist foreign policy, that they align with Israel. And so I think it's important that we mention that. But that being said, I think, Phyllis, you spoke to a lot of the challenging that's been happening. And I think this also speaks to direct action. We need to make assessments as to what kind of power do we have as people in the Palestinian movement and supporters and solidarity activists in the Palestinian movement. And I would say that our power is in numbers. And the best way to challenge is through direct action, as we just spoke about, and through leveraging our power in numbers. Power is not going to concede anything except in the face of more power. We don't have, billions and billions of dollars currently. We don't have 100 people in Congress yet, but we do have a lot of numbers. And when we think about strategic direct action with our numbers, this is how we can start to win in this fight.
Thanks, Mohammed. Another question from Charles Douglas: for groups that engage in electoral work directly with candidates, are any of you suggesting that we don't at all support progressive candidates who don't align with supporting Palestinian rights or the BDS movement, or that we support and pressure them simultaneously? Thinking specifically of known progressive and liberal candidates who may be persuadable eventually. One example might be Stacey Abrams. You spoke about this a bit, Mohammed. I wonder if one of the others, if Lubna or Josh want to jump in on this one as well, about dealing with candidates.
Yeah, Josh, why don't you go first?
I would just say briefly that I would love to have that conversation privately and not on YouTube live streams.
Makes sense. I do think that the way the questioner phrased the question is a good answer to it too, which is that we need to do a lot of yes and rather than yes but. So particularly when we're building alliances in our movements, members of Congress, members of city councils, members of all kinds of political agencies are very important to many of our allies who are not doing a good job on Palestine. And we have to do both. We have to support them on those things and pressure them on Palestine, I would say. I think we have time for only one or two more questions. Let me see what we have here. If another one on, whoops, let's see here. This is another one going back to the parallels with Ukraine, ideas for leveraging emotional support for Ukraine to have conversations with friends who have little familiarity with other refugee tragedies, including Palestine. That, of course, is something that several have talked about. Katie, you haven't spoken in a while. Do you want to sort of respond on this one about what the possibilities are in terms of that kind of direct engagement with folks?
Well, what I would really recommend to people is to read the human rights reports of organizations like DCI Palestine, of Palestinian organizations like El Haq, like Palestinian organizations like Ad-Damir or El Mizan or Palestinian Center for Human Rights. And this is where, unfortunately, on a daily basis, you are told the truth, the story, the history of what is happening in Palestine to civilians, of families that are being torn apart, parents that are losing children, of homes that are being demolished, of futures that are being curtailed. And as Mohammed mentioned, three of those organizations that I just mentioned have been listed as terrorist organizations. So they are under severe attack. So I think it's a matter of informing yourselves about what is happening to Palestinians every day in Palestine and also in the diaspora, who aren't allowed to go home and be reunited with family members, as well as standing up to create space for Palestinian civil society, for journalists, for academics, for historians, for human rights organizations to operate.
I think that's going to have to be our last call, our last question. We have only a few more minutes, and I think I have the privilege now of introducing Craig Corrie, who was one of the co-founders of the Rachel Corrie Foundation for Peace and Justice, has of course been at the center of the foundation's work for 19 years. He was also Rachel's father, and as with Cindy, I am very proud to call him a dear friend. Craig, it's over to you.
Thank you, Phyllis. And I want to thank everybody that joined us here tonight. It's been a real pleasure. You panelists and you, Phyllis, have given us a great deal to think about. You know, when we started doing this, I guess it's really been 18 years ago, in the anniversary of Rachel's death, it was a sort of a local gathering. And I suppose we'd be lucky if we got 100 people. We had almost 250 tonight because we were forced to go online. And as my grandmother used to say, it's every cloud has a silver lining. In those previous days, we try to get together, share a little food. The people that are on camera aren't able to share the food while they're on camera, but I have a hunch that the rest of you are probably doing that. And so that's wonderful. And you've given us, we try to have something to think about, and community, we've managed to do all that. And the other thing is we try to raise a little money. So I want to remind you that the donations that come in today, and you have until midnight West Coast time, so you've got a few more hours to get them in, and they will go to Gaza Community Mental Health, and I'm terribly proud of that. And what's more, if after that you want to donate to Gaza Community Mental Health, just through your donation, you can probably put what it goes to. You can find a way to get that message through to me. I'm the treasurer. I'll make sure it goes where it's supposed to. So for all of us, thank you and good night.
دومدي تاك اسألينا أجوبتنا على المحك يا ليه دومدي تاك سايرة فينا هالسفينة بس ما ياكلنا السمك دومدي تاك اسألينا أجوبتنا على المحك يا ليه دومدي تاك سايرة فينا هالسفينة بس ما ياكلنا السمك.
حياة كئيبة ما بتعطي شمل لحد، واللي كان عنده أمل صفطوا الدنيا على المحك. في ناس في الغربة هتشوفك ابن بلد ويسألوك هل جاي سياحة ولا الوضع ألهبك. أوقاتنا صعبة والرحلة طريقها مد، حاولت إني أفكر فيها من التفكير عقل ارتبك. والساعة واقفة ما بتمشيش زمنتك، بس بالمواقف الحلوة بتلف زي المفكفع.
دومدي تاك اسألينا أجوبتنا على المحك يا ليه دومدي تاك سايرة فينا هالسفينة بس ما ياكلنا السمك. دومدي تاك اسألينا أجوبتنا على المحك يا ليه دومدي تاك سايرة فينا هالسفينة بس ما ياكلنا السمك.
دومدي تاك مجنون بنظرتي للدنيا بستناها تمشي، مع اني عارف انه الدنيا الدولار بس فيها بمشي. رفعنا ايدنا بس للي خلقنا، ما مدينا ايدنا لي بشرة تكتب كتير صرت اغني. سؤال ومر علينا ليه حياتنا كلها هيك، فيش سكينة لا في راحة لو ضحكنا بضحكة فيك. قالوا اضحك للدنيا تضحك لك، من ضحكي مليت حتى حظي شارد بجيتار وانا لحقه بسكاليت.
دومدي دومدي تك دومدي دومدي تك، اسألينا اسألينا أجوبتنا على المحك يا ليل. دومدي دومدي تك دومدي دومدي تك، سايرة فينا هالسفينة بس ما ياكل السمك.
دومدي دومدي تك دومدي دومدي تك، اسألينا اسألينا أجوبتنا على المحك. دومدي دومدي تك دومدي دومدي تك، سايرة فينا هالسفينة بس ما ياكلنا السمك. سلامي للي عاش وكافح ما بيحكي يا ريت، بيسعى رغم اللي بيصير ليسوي نفسه من هالجيت. مصيرها تزبط وتكون عاليائس جواتنا هيت، فحاول اوعك تحكي حظي معطر وانا في ابتليت. ظلمنا حالنا وهملناها روحنا هيك كتير، حتى عقلك وتفكيرك محتاجينه للتقدير. فتسك من الكآبة ركز هسا باللي بصير، خلي روحك حلوة لأنه لازمها تغيير.
دومدي دومدي تك دومدي دومدي تك، اسألينا اسألينا أجوبتنا على المحك يا ليل. دومدي دومدي تك دومدي دومدي تك، سايرة فينا هالسفينة بس ما ياكلنا السمك. دومدي دومدي تك دومدي دومدي تك، اسألينا اسألينا أجوبتنا على المحك يا ليل. دومدي دومدي تك دومدي دومدي تك، سايرة فينا هالسفينة بس ما ياكلنا السمك. دومدي دومدي تك دومدي دومدي تك، اسألينا اسألينا أجوبتنا على المحك يا ليل. دومدي دومدي تك دومدي دومدي تك، سايرة فينا هالسفينة بس ما ياكلنا السمك.
من وين نبدأ؟ احكي اللي انت بتحكي. دومدي دومدي تاك دومدي دومدي تاك.
اللي عاش وكافح ما بيحكي يا ريت، بيسعى
فوق شوي. تعال خالد.
Don't